Now, I've heard this very topic discussed many times, and I've heard it discussed in ways that were very simplistic, and I've also heard it discussed in ways that have absolutely left my head spinning. And it's arguably one of the most difficult aspects of landscape photography, and it has to do with focus. Where to focus, how to focus, with the ultimate goal being, how do you get a landscape photo perfectly sharp from the foreground to the midground, all the way through to the background? And that's the topic of this week's video, is to discuss 5 very simple steps to get perfectly sharp landscape photos. And to jump right into it, the very first step is to establish a rock-solid foundation. Establish your foundation or a shake-free environment. That's the ultimate goal. So you want to use a sturdy tripod. You want to use a remote shutter release or a 2-second timer, whichever one you have. I have both, but I never use my remote shutter release. It's just one less thing I have to bring on location if I don't use it, and I just become so used to using a 2-second timer. But the ultimate goal is you just want to alleviate the potential for any additional camera shake when you actually press the shutter button. If you have a camera strap, you want to remove that as well. And if it's difficult to remove, don't worry about it. You can just wrap it around your ball head or wrap it around one of your tripod legs. But you ultimately just want to avoid the situation where you have your camera strap hanging off your tripod and there's a little bit of wind that comes by and it blows your camera strap, and that's ultimately going to create camera shake as well. So you want to make sure that doesn't happen. If you happen to be shooting with a lens that has image stabilization or a camera that has in-body stabilization, you want to turn both of those off. You don't need either one of those. If you are shooting in a windy environment, you can always lower your tripod. And you always want to you want to collapse your thinnest tripod legs first. Your thickest tripod legs, those are going to be the most sturdy, so collapse the thinnest ones first. And if you want to weight your tripod down, you can definitely do that as well, but you ultimately want to create a solid foundation or that shake-free environment that we spoke about, and that's the very first step. Now, once you have that completed, you can move on to step 2, which is ultimately just figuring out what focus mode you want to shoot in. You got to choose your focus mode, and there's really 4 main ones. You have continuous focus, which is ultimately, it's great for tracking moving subjects. So if you're shooting sports, or maybe you're shooting wildlife, it's great for that. And your camera is ultimately going to be focusing the entire time. It's constantly going to be focusing, looking to lock focus on whatever is moving throughout your scene. And then you have single focus mode, which is basically you're going to tell the camera when to focus, and it'll focus, and it will not focus again until you tell it to. The third method is automatic focus, and that's basically you telling the camera that, camera, I don't want anything to do with focus. I want you to handle everything for me. And it's basically just going to bounce around between single focus mode and continuous focus mode, ultimately just trying to determine exactly what focusing method is best for whatever scene you're trying to capture at that time. And then the fourth mode is manual mode, which is basically you telling the camera that you don't want your camera to have any control over focus. You want to handle it all yourself, and you're going to do it all manually by using the focus ring on your lens barrel. And I know manual focusing might seem a little intimidating to some, and I wasn't very good at it either. I don't have the best eyes, but with the introduction of focus peaking, that's made it a lot easier. And if you're not familiar with what focus peaking is, it's ultimately your camera indicating exactly edges of your scene that are in focus. So when you have focus peaking turned on, this will show up as like red indicators or yellow indicators. I think cameras today actually let you pick what color you want your focus peaking to be. But it's going to tell you when your image is in focus and when areas of your image are not in focus. And a great way to practice, and I really recommend this for anyone who doesn't use manual focusing or has never used their focus peaking, is when you get at home, you can put your camera on a tripod, or you can just set it on a table and just find something to focus on. You could focus on a plant or a Rubik's Cube. It really doesn't matter what it is, but just focus on something and enable your focus peaking, and then turn your focus barrel or your focus ring on your lens barrel, and you can just see how the focus peaking can kind of fade in and fade out, and that's just a really good way to become more comfortable using manual focus. Now, the 2 focusing methods that I use, and these are the ones that I would recommend, is a single point of focus and then manual focus. Now, with single point, I would always use, I always use a very small focus point. Instead of using a zone or a large area, instead of telling your camera, I want you to focus on the left zone or the center zone or the right zone, that's fine. But ultimately, your camera is going to try and determine exactly where is the best area in that zone to focus. And if you want to have the most control over where your camera is going to focus, pick the smallest focus point possible. That way you can place it at any given point in your scene and use single focus mode, and that's exactly where your camera is going to focus. So that's what I use most of the time. Sometimes I'm in situations where there's not a lot of ambient light and the focusing system on my camera has a hard time picking it up or locking focus. In that situation, I'll just switch to manual mode and do it manually. But that's the second step, choosing your focus mode. Now, once you have your foundation solidified, shake-free environment, we know what focus mode we're going to shoot in. The third step is your exposure triangle or your camera settings. First part of that is your ISO. So what ISO are you going to shoot at? I recommend always shooting at the lowest ISO possible for your given situation for two reasons. One, a low ISO is always going to result in an image that has less digital noise and ultimately a cleaner image. And number two, an image shot with a very low ISO, it will always result in a sharper image. So if you take an image, let's say at f11, at ISO 100, and you take that exact same image at f11 ISO 2000, the image at ISO 100 will be substantially sharper than the image at ISO 2000. So that's a quick way right there to get sharper images. Now, number two has to do with shutter speed. And shutter speed's easy when you're shooting on a tripod because you're not shooting handheld. So you usually just want to pick whatever shutter speed is going to give you the exposure level that you need for your particular scene. Now, if you do find yourself in a situation where you didn't bring your tripod, or maybe you're in a rush and you don't have time to set up your tripod and you have to shoot handheld, if you have the luxury of using image stabilization on your lens or in the body of your camera, definitely turn both of those on. And then a quick tip is to shoot one over your focal length. So it sounds a little confusing at first, but if you're shooting at, say, 20 millimeters, you want to shoot at 1/20th of a second. Or if you're shooting at 60 millimeters, you want to shoot at 1/60th of a second. At least that shutter speed. And that should give you an image that has no camera blur resulting from camera shake. So that's shutter speed. And then the third part of the exposure triangle is aperture. What aperture do you want to use? Typically with landscape photography, you want an aperture that has a very large depth of field. So you don't want to use f1.8 or f4 because that's a shallow depth of field. You want to use something f11 and above, f11, f14, f16. And I know you would say, well, can't you just use maybe f22? That should give you the most depth of field because that's the highest f-stop number. And you're right, it's true, that will give you the most depth of field, but that additional depth of field definitely comes at a price, and that price is called diffraction. And without getting super technical, it just has to do with the softening of your image because you're using an aperture value that is so small that the way the light is actually coming through results in an image that is less sharp or an image that is soft. So an image shot at f22 will never, ever be as sharp as an image shot at f11. So you definitely, or I shouldn't say definitely, I never go above f16. I live somewhere between f11 and f16. So that's the third step, is just to determine exactly what your camera settings are going to be. Now the fourth step, and the fourth and fifth step here, these are the biggies. The fourth step has to do with where to focus. So this is a perfect example right here. This is what we're trying to avoid. So this is an image from the Haleakala volcano inside of the crater, actually, in Maui. And this is shot at f16. In the first image, I focused right here on this rock. And you can see that it's perfectly sharp. Everywhere through here is perfectly sharp. But if I zoom out and I go to the mountains in the background is soft. Now if I go to the next image, I focused on the mountains in the background. Now you can see that all of this is perfectly sharp. But if I go back to that rock in the foreground, now this is soft. And that's what we're trying to get away from. And that's something that happens a lot in landscape photography. So there's really three main schools of thought here. The first being, you can set your focus point 1/3 of the way into your scene. And as long as you're shooting at a higher f-stop value, f11 and above, you're more than likely going to be able to get your foreground in focus and your background in focus, as long as you don't have something in your foreground that's just a few feet away from your lens. So here's an example right here. This is Acadia National Park and I think this is called Boulder Beach. And I focus roughly about 1/3 of the way into the scene, which is right here. And as you can see, everything, all the detail in this rock is perfectly sharp. Everything came out perfect, and everything in the background is perfectly sharp as well. So focusing 1/3 of the way into the scene in this situation worked very well. Here's another one right here. And this one worked out perfect because this green patch of grass just happened to be about 1/3 of the way into the scene. So if I zoom in right here, perfect focus. If I zoom into the background, perfect focus. And I didn't mention this, but the image at Boulder Beach in Acadia, that was shot at f11. This image right here is also shot at f11. Now, the second school of thought is to focus on infinity. And you might have heard that before as well. And infinity is one of those words, it can be a little bit confusing. It's not saying to focus on stars or clouds, but ultimately to focus on something that's very far into your scene, something that's deep in your scene. A lot of times it is the farthest subject in your scene. So here's an example where there's nothing really in my foreground. The closest foreground area was right here, which was easily a couple hundred yards away from me. And I just focused right here on the lighthouse. And as you can see, the lighthouse is perfectly sharp. Everything through here is perfectly sharp as well. And that's using the focusing on an infinity method. And here's another example right here where I focused on this waterfall in the background and everything is perfectly sharp. But now this image actually does look like it has some foreground area right here. It's all perfectly sharp, but this area was once again probably at least 50 to maybe 75 feet away from my actual camera. So that's another approach, is the focus on infinity. And the third approach is with hyperfocal distance. And I'm sure you've probably heard this before. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's ultimately how close you can focus your camera and still get your background in focus as well. And this is where it can get very confusing. And I am not smart enough to be able to, calculate the hyperfocal distance equation in my head. There's plenty of depth of field calculators out there you can use. I've used the PhotoPills one before. I think it's probably one of the better ones. And these depth of field calculators are real simple. You basically tell it, what camera you're using, how far you're focused in. Are you focused in, at 20 millimeters or 35 millimeters? What aperture are you using? And how close is your subject? And ultimately, it will calculate and tell you what your hyperfocal distance is. And it'll tell you exactly where you can focus to get the most of your image in focus. So if your hyperfocal distance is 3 feet, it'll also tell you where your near hyperfocal distance limit is, I think is what they call it. And that is usually half of your hyperfocal distance. So if that's 3 feet, your near limit could be 1.5. So half of your hyperfocal distance. I know that's crazy confusing, and I never use it anyway. I can't tell you the last time I was actually on location and I had to pull out my phone to get a depth of field calculator to try and calculate my hyperfocal distance. I really never use it. I always use the focus 1/3 of the way into the scene, or I use the focus on infinity, and that almost always yields the results that I'm looking for. And every once in a while, you'll get really lucky where you have a situation like this, where all you have to do is just focus on your subject, because there's really nothing in the foreground, and it doesn't really matter if the foreground is in perfect focus and the background doesn't matter either. You can just focus on your subject, and that's always super easy to do as well. Now, the fifth and final step here is hands down the most critical one. We've created our RockSolid foundation. We know what focus mode we're using. We know what our exposure triangle and our camera settings are going to be. We know where we're going to focus. And the fifth and final step is just to review those images, is to look on your LCD screen and zoom in and check for sharpness. So you zoom in on the background, and if your background is sharp, zoom in the foreground. And if your foreground is sharp, congratulations, you did it. You're good to go. You don't have to do anything else. Whatever you did, whatever focusing method you used, you win. You got everything perfectly in focus. Now, if you zoom into the background and it's perfectly sharp, and you zoom into your foreground and it's soft, and you used f11, maybe switch that to f14 or f16 and take that same shot and see if that resolved the soft foreground. And if it still didn't, maybe you want to change your focusing method. If you're focusing on infinity, maybe try focusing on 1/3 of the way into the scene. And if that still doesn't solve your problem, maybe back up a little bit. But ultimately, reviewing your images on location, that is so critical, because finding out your image is soft, your foreground is soft, or your background is soft, when you have your images on your computer at home, is not the situation you want to be in, because it's too late. The trip is over. You can't go back, or you can go back, but you can't get that same shot again. So taking just a couple seconds and reviewing your images on your location is absolutely imperative, in my opinion. So those are the 5 simple steps to get perfectly sharp landscape photos. I ultimately wanted to make this as simple as possible, because I operate in a very simplistic way, and it's when I operate the best is when things are easier. So I try to make it as little confusing as humanly possible, and I hope I succeeded. So if you have any questions at all, please leave those in the comment section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you enjoyed this week's video, if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really appreciate you watching this week's video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.